Imagine a country that somehow managed to multiply its commercial air traffic by a factor of 100 in just a few decades.
Right. A massive jump.
Exactly. A nation that practically eradicated primary school dropout rates, pulled millions of women out of unpaid informal labor, and built this world-class logistics empire bridging two continents.
It sounds like an absolute economic miracle, honestly.
It really does. But now imagine that exact same country is actively melting down, like suffering from a 105% inflation rate.
Yeah, which is just staggering.
Right. And while that's happening, its core metrics for political stability and institutional trust are plummeting straight into negative territory. So today we're looking at the ultimate macroeconomic paradox.
It is a profound structural contradiction, you know?
Yeah.
You have an economy that, on paper at least, looks like the most vibrant, unstoppable engine of modernization in the emerging market space.
Yeah.
Yet when you look beneath the surface of the shiny new airports and the staggering GDP numbers, you find these hidden tectonic fractures that are threatening to bring the entire system down.
Welcome, everyone, to a deep dive into the Republic of Turkey. For those of you listening, especially if you're the kind of person who loves connecting the dots and, wants to understand how the global economy actually functions without getting lost in all the dense academic jargon, this is your ultimate case study.
Absolutely.
We are unpacking a massive stack of data sets today. We're pulling from decades of highly detailed, granular metrics compiled by the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and this is really cool. We have this brilliant academic presentation focused on the paradox of prosperity and structural transformation.
And it's worth noting the style of this presentation we're looking at. It's incredibly data-driven, very visual.
Oh, yeah, it's very striking. It uses this minimalist, pure white background, so the data really pops.
Right, exactly. Like the very first slide just has this massive red upward arrow. It's designed to make the macroeconomic data undeniable.
So we're going to try and translate that stark visual reality into audio for you today. We are looking at everything from gross domestic product and hyperinflation indices to demographic shifts, greenhouse gas emissions, and the exact volume of container ships moving through their ports.
The central mission of this analysis is to understand how a nation's hard power, meaning its physical infrastructure, its labor force, its raw economic output, can violently collide with its soft power.
Which would be its institutions and governance, right?
Exactly. Soft power is the baseline economic stability, the rule of law. It's the invisible stuff that holds the physical stuff together.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the sheer, unfathomable scale of Turkey's economic growth over the last few decades, and of course, the terrifying shadow that is currently stalking that growth.
Right.
We are talking about the roaring engine and the melting dashboard.
That's a great way to put it. Let's look at the raw physical size of the economy first, because, the baseline achievement here is undeniable.
Yeah, the numbers are huge.
They really are. When you review the World Bank data for Turkey's gross domestic product, specifically measured in constant local currency, to adjust for some historical baselines, the trajectory isn't just a steady climb.
It's explosive.
It's a massive exponential upward curve. On the slide we're looking at, it's this huge area chart in light blue just taking over the entire page.
Yeah.
We are analyzing an economy that has broken through the 100 trillion mark in local currency terms.
100 trillion.
Yeah. Decade over decade, the physical output, the services rendered, the goods manufactured, they've all multiplied at a rate that is, frankly, characteristic of a highly aggressive, deeply ambitious emerging market.
If you were visualizing this data, you would see this enormous sweeping chart completely dominating the screen, just climbing and climbing. I mean, it's the exact kind of chart that makes global investors salivate.
Usually, yes.
But there is a secondary metric attached to this growth, a jagged, highly volatile metric that changes the entire context of that 100 trillion number.
Right. And that brings us to the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, the inflation rate.
And we are not talking about the kind of inflation where, your morning coffee costs 50 cents more than it did last year.
No.
We are looking at a chart, a really aggressive, dark red step line chart in our source material, where the CPI spiked from early, manageable single digits, around 5.6%, to peaks of over 85%.
And according to the data, it even touched a staggering 105.2% at its historical high. The presentation actually circles those two numbers in bright red to show just how violent the shift is.
105%. I mean, the mechanics of what happens to a society at 105.2% inflation have to be devastating.
Oh, absolutely. This introduces the economic concept of the illusion of wealth.
The illusion of wealth. Explain that.
Well, when an economy is growing rapidly on paper, your paycheck might be getting numerically larger. You might technically be a millionaire in nominal terms.
Right, because there are just more zeros on the bills.
Exactly. But if the currency in your pocket is losing its purchasing power that rapidly, if prices are effectively doubling in a single year, the lived reality for the average citizen is actually one of shrinking wealth.
I want to make sure we clearly define the mechanics here for everyone listening. Let's say I'm driving a high-performance sports car, and I have the accelerator pinned entirely to the floor.
Okay, I like this analogy.
I look at the speedometer, which represents our GDP, and it's climbing. I'm hitting 100 miles an hour, 150, 200. The sheer velocity feels like incredible progress.
Right.
But the engine is screaming, the temperature gauge is so hot it's melting the plastic on the dashboard, and my fuel tank is actively leaking all over the highway. The hyperinflation is the engine tearing itself apart from the inside out.
That's spot on. And, a driver in that situation would naturally panic.
Sure.
And that panic is exactly what happens in a hyperinflationary economy. Hyperinflation distorts every single financial incentive a human being has.
Because you can't trust money anymore.
Precisely. Under normal macroeconomic conditions, rational actors save a portion of their income to build capital for the future. You put money in a bank, it earns a little interest, and it hoards its value.
Right.
But when inflation is running at 85 or 105%, saving money in local currency is mathematically equivalent to setting it on fire.
Because the 1,000 liras I save today will only buy half as many groceries by this time next year.
Exactly. Therefore, the rational behavior flips entirely. People spend their money immediately.
Like the second they get it.
The literal moment a paycheck clears, citizens rush to buy groceries, durable goods, real estate, foreign currency, gold, absolutely anything tangible that holds intrinsic value.
Wow.
This frantic velocity of money where everyone is desperately trying to get rid of their liras before they devalue further actually throws more fuel onto the inflationary fire.
Right, really. How does spending it make it worse?
Because it forces aggregate demand up artificially. Everyone is buying everything all at once, which drives prices even higher. It creates a devastating self-sustaining feedback loop.
Wait, if the velocity of money is artificially spiking because everyone is panic buying refrigerators and gold before the price doubles, doesn't that make the GDP numbers look even better on paper?
Yes, that's the illusion.
If the numbers on the paycheck are getting bigger but they buy less housing and less electricity, the economy isn't actually growing, it's swelling.
That's a great distinction.
It's like an allergic reaction where the tissue gets larger but it's entirely unhealthy.
Nominal growth is masking real economic pain. The GDP deflator data we reviewed shows annual growth rates touching 104.7%.
What is the GDP deflator exactly?
Right, so the GDP deflator is a measure of the level of prices of all new domestically produced final goods and services. When that deflator is over 100%, it tells you that the growth you were seeing in the raw numbers is almost entirely composed of price increases.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it's not an actual increase in human productivity, value, or physical output. You are running on a treadmill that is speeding up, but you aren't moving forward in real terms.
And yet, we can't just dismiss the whole Turkish economy as an inflationary mirage. I mean, they did physically transform their country.
Yes, they absolutely did.
To understand how the economy got so massive and so fast in the first place, we have to look past the melting dashboard and look at the chassis of the vehicle itself. We need to examine how Turkey fundamentally altered its physical landscape and what its people actually do for a living.
The data reveals a total modernization leap. It's what developmental economists call a structural transformation.
Okay.
If you look at the World Bank data from decades ago, we have this 100% stacked bar chart showing the share of agriculture versus services.
Right, using those muted blues and greens.
Exactly. And the data for agriculture, forestry, and fishing, value added as a percentage of GDP, well, it's sat at roughly 54.9%.
So more than half of the entire country's economic value was generated directly from the land.
Yes, it was a deeply agrarian society. Today, that number has dropped to around 10.5%.
That is a massive drop.
It is. And while a massive drop in a sector might sound alarming in isolation, in the context of developmental economics, a shrinking agricultural share of GDP is the primary indicator of successful industrialization.
Because they're doing other higher value things now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, the service sector exploded. We see data points showing service sector annual growth rates repeatedly notching over 10%.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You don't just magically switch an economy from 55% farming to a booming modern service and industrial hub by passing a law or snapping your fingers.
No, you certainly don't.
That statistical shift represents a physical human upheaval on the ground.
It represents one of the largest mass migrations in the country's history. We're observing millions upon millions of people uprooting their lives, moving from rural farms and agricultural villages into dense urban service centers.
Like Istanbul.
Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, these cities swelled enormously as the domestic workforce transitioned from seasonal agricultural labor to year-round manufacturing, logistics, tourism, and finance.
And they had to build the physical infrastructure to support that entirely new urbanized economy. The data here is just jaw-dropping.
It's phenomenal.
Let's look at what we can call the logistics dividend. Turkey looked at a map, realized they are the literal physical land bridge between the European and Asian continents, and they built an economic engine entirely around that geography.
They turned their geographic coordinates into a primary global asset. Look at the aviation data.
Yeah, the infographic we have shows this tiny little airplane icon next to a line that just shoots straight up.
Right. The World Bank figures tracking air transport, specifically the number of passengers carried, show an initial baseline of just over 1 million passengers. Over the measured period, that number skyrockets to more than 115 million.
Think about the scale of that for a second. 1 million to 115 million.
It's massive.
That is a 100-fold increase. If we were looking at a bar chart of this, the first year would be an almost invisible sliver, and the current year would be a skyscraper.
And the physical infrastructure required to support 115 million air passengers is staggering. You are building mega airports, specialized rail links, massive fuel depots, and entirely new air traffic control ecosystems.
It's like building an entire new city just for transit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just the movement of human beings. Look at the maritime data. Container port traffic steadily doubled to over 12 million TEUs.
TEU standing for 20-foot equivalent unit, the standard shipping container you see on the back of a semi-truck.
Right. When a country processes 12 million of those containers and 115 million air passengers, you have to extrapolate what that means for their integration into the global economy.
My initial thought is just tourism. You know, people flying into Istanbul for a vacation or heading to the coastal resorts.
Tourism is absolutely a major component. The data shows international tourism arrivals hitting tens of millions. However, a 100x increase in aviation represents far more than just vacationers.
Right, because tourists don't usually ship 12 million cargo containers.
Exactly. This level of infrastructure integration means Turkey established itself as a central, load-bearing node in global supply chains.
Ah, I see.
It represents cargo, high-level business ties, foreign direct investment, and multinational corporations setting up regional headquarters. When you process that kind of volume, you're no longer just a destination.
Your hub.
You are a global transit hub. You become the beating heart of a regional trade network covering Europe, the Middle East, and Asia.
You are building the physical hard power of a modernized, interconnected nation.
Right.
But, and this is crucial, you cannot run a 115 million passenger aviation hub or a digitized banking sector or a massive automated container port with a purely agrarian workforce.
No, it's impossible.
You can't just hand someone who has spent 30 years farming wheat a laptop and say, okay, manage the logistics routing for these 10,000 incoming cargo containers.
Exactly.
This massive physical transformation of the landscape required a total top-to-bottom overhaul of the country's human capital.
And the World Bank data clearly reflects this massive generational investment in the human element. Let's look at the foundational layer. Primary education.
Okay, let's look at it.
The metrics for primary education retention rates, specifically measuring survival to grade 5 as a percentage of the peer group, stabilized at an incredibly impressive 93 to 99%.
So they essentially eradicated early primary school dropout rates.
Yes, by ensuring that almost 100% of children receive that foundational literacy and numeracy. The state built the baseline workforce required to populate that booming service sector a decade later.
Right.
A modern logistics and finance economy runs on basic literacy.
But the most staggering demographic shift in the data isn't the primary school retention. It is the gender revolution in the labor market.
This is perhaps one of the most vital metrics to unpack in the entire data set.
The visual for this in the presentation is really cool, actually. It's a dumbbell plot.
Right, a dumbbell plot. So it shows a line with 2 dots on the ends, emphasizing the massive gap between the historical data and the recent data.
Yeah, and the gap is huge.
It really is. The World Bank tracks a specific category called vulnerable employment. Vulnerable employment typically encompasses unpaid family workers and own count workers.
What does that mean in practical terms?
It is work that is strictly informal. It lacks legal employment protection. It lacks state social security or pension contributions. And it is highly precarious.
So we're talking about working on a family farm without a salary or selling goods informally in a local village market.
Exactly. Historically, the percentage of women in vulnerable employment in Turkey was extraordinarily high, sitting at a precarious 62.8%.
Wow.
Nearly two-thirds of all working women were trapped in this unprotected informal sector. But when we track the trajectory in the data alongside the GDP growth, that number plummets down to 26.1%.
That is not just a statistical adjustment. That is a massive societal restructuring.
Cool.
To visualize what a shift from roughly 62% down to 26% actually looks like on the ground, think about a generational divide. You have a grandmother who spent her entire adult life as an unpaid worker on a rural family farm.
Right.
No formal contract, no legal working hours, no state pension waiting for her. Then you have her granddaughter who moves to the newly expanded city, gets a complete primary and secondary education, and signs a formal employment contract in a logistics firm, a hospital, or a bank.
That's the exact shift we're talking about.
She has legal rights, a steady, trackable paycheck, and she pays into a social security system. That massive percentage drop represents millions of individual human stories undergoing that exact transition.
And the macroeconomic implications of that transition are profound.
How so?
Moving millions of women out of unpaid agricultural labor and into the formal, taxable labor force vastly expands the national tax base and supercharges GDP growth.
Right, because now they're earning and spending.
Exactly. It increases household disposable income, which drives domestic consumption. It is the absolute hallmark of a successful structural transformation.
It's the ideal scenario.
It is. However, alongside this triumph, the demographic data also reveals a ticking clock.
Ah, right. The demographic alarm bells are starting to ring.
While Turkey has been aggressively reaping this demographic dividend, meaning they possessed a massive, young, newly educated workforce driving their economic expansion, that specific demographic window is starting to close.
The slide for this has a little dashed arrow pointing at the aging curve.
Right. The data shows the population aged 65 and over has more than doubled, rising from an early baseline of 4.15% to over 9.17%.
So the entire society is aging, and it's aging on an accelerated timeline.
In macroeconomics, there's a golden rule for emerging markets. You must get rich before you get old.
Get rich before you get old.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
Once a population ages past a certain threshold, the economic burden of healthcare, specialized housing, and state pensions skyrockets. Simultaneously, the proportion of people actively working, paying taxes, and generating wealth begins to shrink. The dependency ratio flips.
It's a literal race against time. It's a race between the graduation rate and the retirement rate.
Exactly.
Let me test a theory here. If the overall workforce is getting older and moving toward retirement faster, does that dramatic influx of women entering the formal workforce act as a sort of temporary life raft keeping the economy afloat?
That is a really interesting way to look at it.
Like the burden of retirees is growing, but because you unlocked this massive, previously untapped pool of formal female laborers, you offset the drag.
That is a highly accurate way to model it. The rapid integration of women into the formal service sector gave the Turkish economy a massive, badly needed injection of productivity.
Right.
It expanded the labor pool just as the early stages of demographic aging began to set in. It functioned perfectly as a vital life raft. But the fundamental reality of a life raft is that it only buys you time.
It doesn't reverse the direction of the ocean current?
Precisely. Eventually, the sheer mathematical weight of the aging demographic will strain the system, regardless of how efficient the labor force is today.
And speaking of straining the system, while near universal education and formal employment contracts have undoubtedly improved the standard of living, this relentless pedal-to-the-metal pursuit of industrial and service sector growth hasn't just strained the demographic pipeline.
No, it hasn't.
It has left a severe, often invisible mark on the physical environment of the country.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this introduces the stark, unavoidable trade-offs of what economists classify as extensive growth.
Extensive growth, what is that exactly?
Extensive growth is economic expansion achieved simply by throwing more raw inputs into the machine. You add more labor, you burn more fuel, you clear more land, you consume more raw materials.
As opposed to intensive growth, where the economy expands because you are getting better, smarter, and more technologically efficient with the exact same amount of resources.
Exactly. Turkey's data shows the classic textbook symptoms of a prolonged, extensive growth phase. We should look at the positive side of that ledger first, which is found in the health metrics.
Right, because burning all that fuel paid for some good things.
It did. Because of the massive economic boom, the state generated the resources to drastically improve healthcare infrastructure and social safety nets. The data shows significant, highly commendable drops in neonatal mortality.
That's amazing.
We see drops in the overall disease burden and a steadily rising human development index. The population is living longer, healthier lives.
When you think about extensive growth, you picture these shiny, newly constructed hospitals. You picture better sanitation systems being laid down in expanding cities, modern medical equipment being imported to save infants' lives.
Yes.
It is the absolute best possible outcome of raw economic growth.
But that growth, driven by heavy industry and massive infrastructure projects, requires immense amounts of energy and industrial output.
And that energy has to come from somewhere.
Right. When a nation industrializes that rapidly, environmental regulations and green technologies almost always lag decades behind the economic expansion.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The data tracking Turkey's ecological footprint is heavy. The presentation uses a dual-axis chart here to really drive the point home.
Yeah, it shows GDP climbing on one axis and emissions climbing on the other.
Let's look specifically at the greenhouse gas emissions. The World Bank tracks nitrous oxide N2O emissions. Nitrous oxide is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas, heavily associated with intensive agricultural fertilizer use and large-scale industrial processes.
And what does the data show?
The data shows these specific emissions surging from 13.9 million metric tons of CO2, equivalent to 24.5 million metric tons.
That is nearly double the emission volume.
And when you look at the total greenhouse gas emissions, even excluding land use changes, you see a similar relentless upward climb.
So we have this vivid, confronting reality. Down on the ground, you have the shiny new hospitals, the newly paved roads, the modern container ports.
Right.
But above it all, you have these massive, invisible plumes of greenhouse gases hanging over the newly industrialized zones. It is the ultimate societal trade-off.
It really is.
You are buying longer lifespans and better living standards for your citizens today, but you are paying for it by degrading the environmental baseline of tomorrow.
And finding a new equilibrium, transitioning away from that dirty, resource-heavy, extensive growth toward clean, high-tech, intensive, and sustainable growth requires immense capital investment.
Billions and billions of dollars.
Exactly. You need billions to overhaul energy grids, upgrade factory emission standards, and fund green technology. And to attract that kind of patient long-term capital, you need a highly stable, predictable environment where investors feel absolutely safe locking their money away for 20 years.
And that pivot, that brings us to the absolute core of this entire deep dive.
It does.
Because to attract that capital, you need an environment of trust. We've spent all this time talking about the hardware of Turkey, the massive airports, the deep water ports, the new hospitals, the educated workforce.
The physical reality.
Exactly. Now we have to look at the operating system running all of that hardware. We have to look at the institutions.
This is where the diagnostic dashboard is flashing blindingly red.
Yeah, the charts get pretty grim here.
They do. And it is vital to state for clarity that we are looking strictly at data-driven metrics reported by international monitoring organizations like the World Bank and global governance indices.
Right.
We are examining objective third-party assessments of institutional stability, not engaging in political commentary.
Absolutely. We are just reading the telemetry from the sensors mounted on the economy, and the telemetry says the software is crashing.
Let's examine the Political Stability and Absence of Violence Terrorism Index.
Yeah.
The presentation visualizes this with a horizontal band chart, all in dark gray, with the negative values on the left side of the center line.
And it leans very heavily to the left.
Yes. This metric measures the perceived likelihood of political instability, violent internal conflict, or terrorism disrupting the state. The scale generally runs from roughly -2.5 to +2.5.
Okay.
Turkey's data has lived chronically in negative territory. More alarmingly, the trajectory has worsened over time, with the estimate eventually plummeting below -2.0.
A -2.0 on a scale that only goes to -2.5.
Yes.
That represents extreme critical vulnerability.
Furthermore, We must look at the control of corruption estimate. We have these minimalist spark lines on the slide showing the trend.
The black lines on the white background.
Exactly. This metric measures perceptions of the extent to which public power is exercised for private gain, including both petty and grand forms of corruption, as well as the capture of the state by elites and private interests.
And what did the spark lines show?
Again, the data shows a severe, undeniable slide. It moved from a relatively neutral baseline of negative 0.14 steadily downward, hitting negative 0.50.
Okay, wait. Let me put on my skeptic's hat for a second, because if I'm listening to this, I might be thoroughly confused right now.
Okay, go ahead.
You just spent the first half of this deep dive telling me the roads are beautifully paved, the megaports are processing 12 million shipping containers, 115 million people are flying through state-of-the-art airports, and the population is highly educated and living longer.
That's true.
If the hardware is that undeniably good and the economy is physically functioning, why does a political stability score of negative 2.0 matter so much to the global market?
This raises an important question, and it's a very common misunderstanding.
Can an economy just run on autopilot if the infrastructure is good enough? Why should an international investor care about the software if the machine clearly turns on and generates profit?
That is the central illusion that traps many rapidly developing nations, and it is the key to unlocking this entire paradox.
Okay, explain it to me.
To understand why a negative 2.0 stability score matters, you have to look at exactly how all that magnificent hardware was paid for.
Okay, let's trace the money.
Turkey did not build 100-fold increases in aviation capacity and massive logistics networks entirely with cash on hand from domestic savings.
Right. They didn't just have trillions lying around.
No. They fueled this unprecedented infrastructure boom by borrowing heavily from foreign capital markets. They relied on massive infusions of foreign debt.
They put the modernization of the country on a credit card.
A massive, internationally financed credit card. Let's look at the external debt data. The metric for short-term external debt, meaning debt that must be paid back or rolled over in less than 1 year, rocketed from single digits in the early baseline to over $157.1 billion US.
$157 billion. That is due in the short term, not in 10 years, but almost immediately.
And this is where the hardware versus software dynamic proves its point. Infrastructure is physical hardware, but the rule of law, political stability, and the control of corruption, that is the operating system.
Ah, I see where you're going with this.
The operating system is the only thing that gives foreign investors the confidence to lend a country $157 billion.
Right.
If an investor, say a major European pension fund, fears that a sudden political shock might occur, or that courts won't honor their contracts because corruption is rising, or that the government might suddenly impose capital controls trapping their money inside the borders,
They pull their money out.
they pull it out immediately.
They don't care how beautiful the airport is if they legally can't get their money back out of the country.
Precisely. The hardware is completely useless in generating global trust if the software is corrupted. When investors lose confidence, because that political stability score hits negative 2.0, they stop lending.
Well, they charge way more to lend.
Exactly. If they do lend, they demand exorbitant, punishing interest rates to compensate for the massive risk they are taking.
And let's connect this back to the very first thing we talked about, the hyperinflation.
Yes, let's connect the dots.
If I'm a Turkish construction company and I owe a European bank $1 million next month.
You have $157 billion in short-term debt across the economy, much of it denominated in foreign currencies like US dollars or euros.
Right.
But your local currency, the lira, is experiencing 85%, 105% inflation. The currency you earn your revenue in is losing its value at a breathtaking pace.
So every single day that passes, the actual amount of local lira I need to generate just to pay back one single US dollar of debt gets larger and larger.
Yes.
The debt is compounding not because I borrowed more, but because my own money is evaporating.
It becomes a ticking financial time bomb. The debt burden effectively multiplies. This is the lethal systemic combination of weak institutions, high foreign debt, and hyperinflation.
That's a doom loop.
It is a textbook vicious cycle that destroys emerging markets. The eroding institutional foundations trigger capital flight as investors panic. That capital flight crashes the value of the local currency.
And the crashed currency spikes inflation.
And that inflation makes the foreign debt mathematically unpayable.
Wow. So with all this debt coming due, the currency burning up in the inflationary fire, and foreign investors fleeing the negative stability scores, where is the money for the future supposed to come from?
That is the million-dollar question.
How does the country keep the lights on and fund the transition to clean energy we talked about?
Well, if you ask certain isolated domestic metrics, they will tell you there is plenty of money.
Wait, really?
Yes. And this brings us to the final, perhaps most insidious economic concept in our entire analysis: the illusion of savings and the middle income trap.
The illusion of savings. Walk me through the mechanics of that.
If you look at the raw data for nominal domestic savings in Turkey, measured in current local currency, the numbers look phenomenal.
Like, how phenomenal?
Technically, domestic savings are growing. The figures stretch into the trillions of liras. On paper, it looks like the domestic population is hoarding massive amounts of capital.
Okay, so that sounds good.
Capital that could theoretically be used to pay off the external debt or fund new green infrastructure.
But the word nominal is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, isn't it?
It is the ultimate trap. I want you to imagine holding a trillion liras in a standard savings account.
It sounds fantastic. I'm a trillionaire. I feel financially secure.
It feels like a massive victory until you walk out of the bank, go to a real estate office, and realize that because of 105% inflation, the price of a house or a car or even a basic loaf of bread just quadrupled while your money was sitting safely in the vault.
Right. My trillion liras is worthless now.
That trillion liras buys you a fraction of the real physical goods it could have bought just 12 months ago. It is an economic mirage.
So the nominal growth, the actual number of zeros sitting in the bank account, is completely meaningless if the purchasing power is gutted.
The true measure of an economy's ability to fund its future is what economists call adjusted net savings.
Adjusted net savings.
This metric strips away the illusion. It accounts for the depreciation of physical capital, the depletion of natural resources, the cost of pollution damage, and the real purchasing power of the currency.
And what does that show?
When you look at the adjusted net savings for Turkey, we have a scatter plot showing this divergence. The picture is vastly less rosy. The real sustainable capital accumulation required to fund the next stage of development is severely lagging.
And that failure to accumulate real capital leads us straight into the concept of the middle income trap.
Exactly.
Think of national economic development like playing a complex video game.
Okay.
The strategy that successfully gets you through the early levels, say, moving people from farms to cities, building basic factories, pouring concrete for roads, is highly effective at first. You level up quickly.
Right.
But that exact same strategy actually prevents you from beating level 6. Because level 6 doesn't require more concrete. It requires high-tech innovation, advanced intellectual property, and complex service economies.
That is a perfect framework. The academic presentation we reviewed models this exact dilemma using a 4-quadrant matrix on the final slide.
Yeah, let's break that down.
Let's synthesize the entire diagnostic we've covered today. In the top left quadrant, we have the strengths, the hard power.
Which is the modernized service sector, the massive logistics infrastructure processing millions of people.
Yes, near universal basic education, a radically transformed, formalized labor market that integrated millions of women.
But then, in the bottom right quadrant, we have the weaknesses, the collapse of soft power.
Devastating hyperinflation, wiping out purchasing power, sliding governance quality and political instability terrifying foreign capital, and a crushing, unmanageable burden of short-term external debt.
So what does this all mean? The hardware is state-of-the-art, but the operating system is riddled with fatal bugs.
The ultimate verdict is that Turkey is standing at a historic, incredibly dangerous crossroads. They have achieved something miraculous over the last few decades.
Yeah, they really have.
They physically dragged their economy into the modern era through sheer force of will and geography. But the model that got them here, relying purely on foreign credit and relentless, extensive infrastructure expansion, has reached its absolute mathematical limit.
Because you can't just borrow your way to infinity if no one trusts your institutions to protect their money.
Relying on concrete and credit will not get them past the middle income trap. To break through that invisible ceiling and become a high-income, fully advanced economy, you have to innovate. You have to create high-tech intellectual property.
And innovation, real, sustainable, forward-looking innovation, requires absolute trust in the system.
It requires rock-solid institutional anchors. It requires a transparent rule of law where patents are protected.
Right.
It requires political stability so researchers and corporations feel safe investing over decades. It requires an independent central bank that can forcefully control inflation so that savings actually retain their value.
Without those invisible soft power institutions, the physical economic miracle simply stalls out and begins to consume itself.
It does.
It is just a phenomenal cautionary story. We have taken a massive journey today. We started with the roaring engine of an economy breaking 100 trillion in GDP growth.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We tracked the largest mass migration and physical landscape transformation in a nation's history, watching agriculture collapse from 55% down to 10%. We saw millions of women move from unpaid farm labor to formal contracts in gleaming new cities, acting as a demographic life raft against an aging population.
And we examined the incredible health gains bought at the severe cost of massive greenhouse gas footprints.
But ultimately, every single thread comes back to that melting dashboard, the hyperinflation, the foreign debt, and the eroding institutional foundations that are threatening to bring the entire sports car to a screeching, catastrophic halt.
The data tells a story that should be meticulously studied by every single developing nation on Earth. It is the ultimate, undeniable proof that hard infrastructure cannot outrun soft institutions forever. You can build all the airports in the world, but at some point, the bill for governance comes due.
I want to leave you with a lingering concept to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. Think about this dynamic not just in terms of global macroeconomics, but think about your own country or even the company you work for. Is it possible to be too successful on the outside while rotting on the inside?
That's a great question.
If a nation perfectly modernizes its physical reality, building the biggest airports, the best hospitals, the finest schools, but fails to secure the invisible institutions of trust, rule of law, and stability, is that prosperity permanent? Or is it just a rental waiting to be repossessed by the debt collectors?
It's a precarious position.
It really is. Keep an eye on Turkey's next move, because right now, in real time, they're writing the definitive textbook on the absolute limits of extensive growth. Thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive. We loved unpacking this massive mystery with you. Until next time, keep questioning the data, keep looking past the surface, and keep exploring.